Well, good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Common Practice. My name is Matt Rustin. I'm the Executive Director at Made to Flourish. And I'm glad you can join us today. Common Practice is this regular check-in moment we have as the Made to Flourish Network to come together and to figure out how we can be leading our organization, shepherding the church as pastors during these challenging times. This week, our conversation is around generosity. And how do we cultivate a generous congregation in uncertain times? Or maybe some of us joining the call today, maybe you're not a pastor, but you lead an organization or in another role. And how do we think well about activating generosity in our own lives and in those that we know and that we lead? I want to start with a question today and kind of frame our time a little bit. As you think about the last several months and all that's been going on in our world, which we certainly don't need to be reminded about, but a global health pandemic. On the heels of that, an economic crisis, mass unemployment, just a lot of fear and anxiety. And then this nationwide movement, these calls for justice for Black lives after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And then just the ongoing nature of this pandemic that we don't know when it's going to end and what's going to happen in the future. And the question around that is this: what does generosity have to do with all of that? Or more to the point, how as leaders, as pastors or wherever you're leading, how are we thinking about calling our congregations or the people we lead to live generously during times like these, when the needs have rarely been greater around us, and yet so many people are fearful for their own future. They may be fearful for their own bank account and their own sense of what's coming. I was looking at some data earlier this week, and there are a couple data points that tell very different parts of the story around generosity, very different aspects. The first comes around the national savings rate. And if you were to look in 2019, even early 2020, and you asked what percentage of people's income do they typically save on the average month, that number is typically around 7 to 8%, maybe high 7%. Of someone's monthly income, they're putting way towards savings. That was true in January of this year, but in February, you saw a slight uptick as the news was growing to about 8.4%. Then you get to March, and that takes a massive leap to 12.6% of people's monthly income that they were saving. Then you go to April. You think about where we were April 20th of this year in the pandemic. That skyrockets to a shocking 32.2% of people's income was being saved. We've got a little graph here that you can see that. That tips back down in May to 23.2%. But clearly you can see these numbers are skyrocketing. And if you just looked at that graph, what would be the story that you would tell from that? I look at that and I say, it looks like people are hunkering down, that even if they have a job, even if they have income coming in, they're thinking 4-6 months down the line, they do not know what's coming and they're stockpiling cash. That could be a story that people aren't being generous, that they're thinking more about how to kind of safeguard their own financial future. So that's one story that's happening in our country right now. On the other hand, there's another story, and I don't know if you've been reading stories about this in the news or maybe in your Facebook feed, but there's all sorts of examples of generosity going on right now, from little acts of generosity to really big acts of generosity. I was looking at this as well, and one example is the company Instacart. This is the service that delivers groceries to your door, and there's all these shoppers that go around and they take your order and groceries delivered to your door. There was a report from Instacart that they said customer tips were up 99% in the last couple months. The average shopper that's doing that work, collecting groceries, their tipping income has about doubled in the last couple months. A spokesman for the grocery delivery service said that by March, 97% of all orders included a tip. And in May, that number is actually 99%. So what's all that about? You order groceries and maybe before you wouldn't have tipped that person, but you're thinking, you know what? I bet that person working, they could use some extra income, and you give a tip. That's a small act of generosity, but that's a trend that we're seeing in lots of different service industries. That's an expression of generosity. We could go on and on about stories of companies like Allstate returning about $600 million in premiums for less driving, or Microsoft that instituted a 12-week paid leave for parents that are juggling workloads and babysitting and all those things like that, on and on. There's also stories from the church. I don't know if you heard about this initiative, Churches Helping Churches. But it was an initiative basically to help urban churches that were struggling, might need to close down their doors. And they said, what if we look for churches that have a little bit more economic cushion? Could we have them give money to churches that are in need? And hundreds of thousands of dollars were raised for that initiative and given from churches that had resources to less fortunate churches. So these stories are all around us as well. So you have these kind of two sides of the coin. One is people are scared about their future, they're hunkering down. And the other side is people long to be generous and they want to be creative in their generosity. So as leaders, as pastors, our question is, we've got this responsibility to call people to generosity all the time. That's rooted in God's nature. He's generous with us. Jesus Christ gives his life for us. But how do we talk about generosity and call people and inspire them towards generosity when the world seems so uncertain and our future is uncertain? Well, I'm so glad to have our panelists today that are going to help us with that question, and certainly looking forward to interacting with all of you. But our first panelist is Nikki Sorum, and Nikki is the Senior Vice President of Membership at Thrivent. And if you know anything about Thrivent, you know that they've been in this business of both helping people steward their finances wisely, but also activating generosity. And they have over 2.3 million members, and they've been doing this for over 100 years. So they know a lot about thinking, how do you help people think about generosity and taking steps? Nikki, so glad you can join us today. Would you talk a little bit about Thrivent and your work there?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you, all of you listeners on the phone this morning and taking some time from your busy lives. Yes, I'm blessed. I tell my kids I get to go to work, although right now in my home office, virtual, I get to work at Thrivent Financial. We are a Fortune 500 member-owned financial services organization. We serve about 2.3 million clients, and we help them achieve financial clarity, have clarity around their money, so that they can live lives of meaning and gratitude. We start from a premise that all we have is a gift from God. We actually are a membership organization of Christians, started from the Lutherans 100 years ago, now serving all Christians as of 6-7 years ago. And we believe money is a tool that is a gift from God, that when we have clarity on how that money should be used, how we connect it to our faith, that people are in a much better place to do good things with their savings, but also good things with their gratitude and with their generosity.
Yeah, I love that, Nikki, and so excited to have you talk a little bit more, unpack some of the ways that you're thinking about that at Thrivent. But thanks for joining us today. Our second panelist is Dan Reed, and Dan is the founder and CEO of Seed Fundraisers. And known Dan for a couple of years, and one of the things that happens if you get to know Dan at all and have conversations with him is that he's so passionate about, but also so thoughtful about generosity. And seeing it not merely as people who call people to be generous, whether you're a pastor or whether you're a fundraiser, not merely as a necessary evil to keep the mission going, but as a vocation, as a calling to call people towards generosity, and really thoughtful about that. They're doing great work. Dan, thanks for joining us. Would you tell us a little bit about your work at Seed Fundraisers?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me this morning. I appreciate it. So Seed Fundraisers, we spend all of our time equipping, coaching, training professional fundraisers, executive directors in philanthropy, any leaders where fundraising is either their entire occupation or a portion of their occupation. And that's what we get to spend all of our time doing, is talking fundraising. We're one of those, I guess those folks, a group of folks that actually love the work of fundraising, which very few people actually ever say or are willing to admit, even if it were true. But we really enjoy it. So we do that through a variety of different ways, but primarily we really dive deep with leaders in their organizations to help build fundraising operations. But with all that said, the primary heart behind all that work is a deep, deep belief that activating generosity is an occupational conviction that we desperately need in our culture. And so those that possess that can make great fundraisers. They can also make great pastors, probably too. But we and that might be the great link between being a pastor and being a fundraiser.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Dan. Excited to dive more into this conversation in a few moments. I want to start with a poll before we dive in and hear from our panelists today. So should pop up on your screen a couple questions, and just to get a sense for what you're seeing, what you're hearing, how you're feeling. But the first question, answer this, if you would, dive in. In the past few months, generosity has been a prominent theme in my church. Either maybe you're a pastor and you've been talking about it a lot, or you're a congregant and you've been hearing this from your church. So very much so, a little bit or not at all. And then secondly, you personally, how comfortable do you feel about calling your congregation or others toward generosity? So what is your comfort level there? Results are pouring in, and thanks for answering that poll. We'll continue to watch that. But the first question, we'll end it in about 10 seconds here. So I'll give you about 10 more seconds to answer that. But the very first question, it looks like most of you said very much so, 55%. So that's encouraging. More than half of you said in your churches, this has been a prominent theme that you've been hearing about in the last couple months. About a third of you said only a little bit. It came up every once in a while, and almost 10% of you said not at all. This is not a theme that you're hearing in your church. We'll go to that second question, and I'm actually going to end the poll right now. That second question is, how comfortable do you feel about calling your congregation or others toward generosity? Again, very similar numbers there. Very comfortable, over 55%. And any time you're comfortable doing that, there's always ways that we can be sharpening the axe and kind of honing our skills. So glad you've joined us today. But about 40% of us said only somewhat comfortable. Maybe you do it, you know you have to do it, but it's maybe not in the wheelhouse of your comfort level. So anyway, thanks for joining in on that poll. And we're going to continue our conversation now. And I want to start with Nikki. You mentioned 2.3 million clients. You've been doing this a long time. You've also been some very intentional efforts to listen to your clients and what they're experiencing, how they're feeling about money, how they're feeling about generosity these past couple months. What have you been hearing from your clients? What have you been seeing? Have there been any trends or movements in the way that people are thinking about their money?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And obviously this is relevant because we serve Christians. With our 2.3 million members, Christianity is our common bond. So maybe some of our findings are relevant to the pastors that are in our audience this morning. So mid-March, obviously the pandemic started. We quickly convened SWAT teams, both for our workforce and for our external client-facing, serving our members. I led that SWAT team. And I would say, Matt, we heard three things from our clients, from our members, and we get millions of calls into our call centers every year, and we have this really cool technology that allows us to sense and understand what we're hearing from them. We've heard three phases really throughout this pandemic. You know, the first couple of weeks, if you remember back, the markets were roiling, and the S&P 500 dropped 35%. The credit markets, bond markets were in a real tizzy. People were getting laid off. And what we heard in our sentiment research is people were panicked. They didn't know what to expect. They were scared. They were frightened. I think that's probably when your savings rates numbers especially went up. And so for that first couple of weeks, we were literally on a daily basis, our investment department was updating people on what was going on in the markets. Our FPs were contacting people. But it was a very scary time as we all tried to figure out this trifecta of pandemic affecting us economically, health-wise, and then emotionally. The next phase that people went into really was, okay, what am I going to do? How do we support our clients? What are they thinking about? And what they were really thinking about quite a bit was their money. And I think they were thinking about their savings rates. And they were wondering, what do I do? Like if I get laid off, what happens then? And what we saw is our call rates, our appointment levels really skyrocketed as people wanted to reach out and first, think about their money. Were they going to be okay financially? Now, more recently, in the last month or so, we've seen a new trend arise. And that is the trend that you mentioned. Like your two themes are almost exactly what we're seeing. People worried about their money now, really thinking about generosity. And how do I live in this new normal? It's probably going to be more of a hybrid world going forward, maybe even after the pandemic, of both virtual and in person. How do I show up? How do I show my generosity? How do I help others? And I think, obviously, we serve Christians, and they come from a place where Jesus told us to go love your neighbor, love your God, love your neighbor. And I think they're showing up loving their neighbor. I also think it makes them feel better in a pandemic to actually not think about their own pocketbook so much, but actually think about others and how do I help out. So those are the three themes that we've been seeing.
Love that, Nikki. And it tells me that we're at a moment right now when people are ready. They've absorbed some of the emotional shock, and at least people who can express generosity, and all of us can at some level. And we'll talk about that in a second, but they're in a place where they're thinking more intentionally about this, and what do they do? How do they steward the resources that God has given them? I want to talk a little bit about, I know at Thrivent, you talk about generosity can take many different expressions, and you've done some research on that together with Barna. But sometimes we think about generosity first and foremost as money and giving money, and certainly that's a huge part of generosity. But you've done some really great research on other expressions. Can you talk about just those findings and what you're hearing, and how that impacts the way generations think about generosity, and what lessons we can learn?
Yeah, we did some fantastic research several years ago now in partnership with Barna, and it is available to you. I've made sure that Made to Flourish has our PDF that does a short version just available out to you. There's also a longer version, a monograph available through Barna. For me, as I looked at the research, the findings, it really expanded my mind of how people think about generosity. A couple big themes that we saw in the research. Number one is we asked generations of people, how did they think about generosity? And I'm looking at the research right now. Boomers, who are probably in that place in their time where they do have money and maybe some time to be generous, about 61% of our boomers said generosity was either extremely or very important to them. 61%, pretty high number. But curiously, across generations, that was the lowest percentage. The highest was actually millennials. So if boomers were 61%, a full 80% of millennials shared that generosity was extremely or very important to them. And so what we see from a generation standpoint is that actually some of our younger generations view generosity as critically important. And I mean, our church, as it looked at this, is like, how can then we reach out to some of these newer generations? Probably through generosity. The second very interesting finding that Matt alluded to in this research is we actually found 5 forms of generosity that people use to express giving back. Money, which we traditionally think of as writing a check, giving away money, was only 22% of people's most important way to give, the most important way to show their generosity. 22% was money. The 2 top ones were actually emotional support and then service. And especially when you went in and looked at millennials, things like hospitality, it actually gave me insight, like, why is Friendsgiving such a big thing, having your friends over for Thanksgiving? That is how millennials show up with their generosity, is they're not just giving checks, they're actually showing up with hospitality, with emotional support. And so while this research was done before COVID, I think it's very enlightening to how do we help, how does Thrivent help, how do churches help people express their generosity in this world. And I think going beyond just money into emotional support, service, hospitality, giving gifts is a very important dimension.
Yeah. Yeah. And it tells me that, that generosity is really in all of life. And certainly many of our pastors have probably spoken on this or thought through this, but just this idea that generosity encompasses the way that we live, and it encompasses all of life in those different expressions. Love that research. Um, just one final question, Nikki, before we go to Dan. And by the way, during this call, you've got for all of our those people who've tuned in, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And at any time during the call, send a question, send a comment. We're going to have some time on the second half of this webinar to go through those. So would love to hear your comments and questions as we go along. But as you look across your members, have there been any creative expressions of generosity that maybe stories that you've been hearing in your network that have especially stood out to you?
This is the most fun part of my job. By the way, I also, Matt, want to just mention, while I said there's other forms of generosity, I know we're going to hear from Dan. Giving money is still a really important form of generosity, right?
Yeah.
So I know Dan will have some great things to say. I actually like fundraising, Dan, so I'm with you on that. So I don't want to take away from that aspect of generosity too. So one of the fun parts of my job is seeing all the creativity that our members pour out when they're living a life of meaning and gratitude, right? Because we believe money is a gift from God. So how do you actually show up and share your generosity? So I looked just here in July to see, during a pandemic, what are some of the very creative things that are going on? And I'll just share a couple that are just fun. First of all, we have, you might not be surprised, but in our churches and with our Christians, and especially our old Lutheran market, we got a lot of sewers, a lot of seamstresses, and they have been busy making thousands and thousands of masks. And so I see a team of 12 mask makers. They use their Thrivent action team. It is a mission in a box program that we have. Every member gets 2 of them a year. My church uses many, many of them to show up with generosity. So members get 2 of them a year, and we basically equip our member in that mission in a box with the materials they need to do an act of generosity. So in this case, they must have taken their $250 gift card. They went and bought a bunch of fabric, and they made these 12 mask makers made a whole bunch of masks for a VA hospital in North Carolina. Another one that I love that I'm seeing here is two churches gathered together in Battle Creek, I'm assuming Michigan, but they used their action team, and they knew, it's the beginning of COVID, we're wondering what to do. One of the churches, Trinity, had a bunch of land, and so they got their property, used that property, went and bought a bunch of seeds with their Thrivent action team and planted a garden. And the pictures that I'm seeing now in early July are the flourishing of the garden coming to bear, and they're actually delivering fresh vegetables now through the other churches, St. Peter's Food Pantry. So a very nice kind of ecumenical partnership between 2 churches funded by Thrivent action teams. Maybe the last one that I'll share here is there's a Wisconsin Bible camp, Camp Luther. My kids went there at one stage, and there was a group of volunteers who used their action team to actually help Camp Luther go rewire and then they purchased and then inserted 160 new LED light bulbs. So they're being greener, and they're also probably being cheaper with their electricity bills. So there's just 3 examples very recently of ways that we see Christians, we see Thrivent members showing up with very creative acts of generosity.
Yeah, I love that, Nikki. And one of the things we talk a lot about at Made to Flourish is an asset-based approach, not merely a needs-based approach, but what are the assets that God has given me and how can that be expressed to others for the good of our communities? And, I'm a quilter, or I can sew, so I'm going to use that as an expression of generosity. Or our church has land. How can God has entrusted us with that. How can we be stewarding that for the good of our communities? So I love those examples that you shared there. We're going to come back to Nikki with your questions, comments. Certainly, if you have any stories about generosity that you're seeing, that you're trying, we'd love to hear those as well. I want to go now to Dan, though. And Dan, I want to continue the conversation. You think a lot about organizations and churches that differentiate themselves in terms of, your language is activating generosity. And there are certain principles, there are certain practices, but what do you see as the key characteristics of churches and organizations that differentiate themselves by being able to activate generosity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think of, to use that, to frame that word differentiate a bit, differentiation is not, let's not use it as like a competitive term to say this is, well, we're not that in that way, but I think what great organizations, great churches do is that they are able to clearly articulate what their desired impact on a community, on a group of people, is going to look like, feel like, and then they make ultimately a missional promise towards that. I think what happens is, the reason why that's activating is that people in their giving, they want to join something that has movement, has energy, has direction to it. It is, I use the example of the car, whether it's the best example or not, I don't know, but the example of the car is I can get really, really excited about the way a car looks and the engine under the hood. But if you want to invite me to do something, you're going to invite me to go somewhere. You're going to invite me to directionally to go do something. And so I think that that's a key component of activating generosity, whether it's in a church setting, a nonprofit organizational setting, et cetera, which is via generosity, via your generosity, join us, participate with us in a direction, in this missional direction outward, beyond ourselves. And I think that's pretty easy to say, that people want to hear missional language. They want to hear directional language. Join us in participating in to achieve something specific. But that's actually not easy to do necessarily, right? That's hard. And I see that that's even harder in church settings, because the church is it's not always headed somewhere necessarily. But I think that, so I think that there's a bit of a challenge, or a bit of a barrier there, not insurmountable, but a challenge to achieving that. But I would say that that's one kind of attribute of an organization that activates generosity at a high level.
Well, questions just come to my mind. I'm thinking of the pastors in our network and on this call, and two realities. One is sometimes our sense of what the church is doing is, it's really important, but it's maybe more general. We're helping people grow in their relationship with Christ. We're helping people, strengthen marriages. We're helping us be more consistent with the Word of God in our lives and applying that. We're more consistent with connecting people. Are those kind of general principles? Is that what you're getting at when you say, like, clarify the missional focus at a church, or does it go beyond that? Because sometimes in our churches, we have very specific initiatives. And then the other side of that is just many of us have walked away from designated giving. We've read Jim Collins and Good to Great, and we've kind of learned that we're not supposed to raise for a particular project. Is that what you're saying, that we need to focus and clarify a specific giving objective, or are what you talking about something different than that?
Yeah, no, let's separate those two things for the sake of the conversation. I think that designated or restricted giving, as in like, hey, let's go build this thing. We need $200,000 to do it. Please consider a gift towards. That's one way, right, to do that. But I think what we're talking about more is is far more around the identity of the organization and the movement within the organization. And I think that's the important piece, which is our church, what happens in our community when we do all these things, when we do focus on spiritual health, when we do focus on biblical literacy, when we do focus on, et cetera, when we become people who follow the way of Jesus more fully, some outcomes occur outside of ourselves. Some outcomes occur outside of our church and those around us. I would love to, as part of a church, I love when my church says, when we worship together, guess what happens to our community? When we worship together, guess what happens to our children? When we worship together, etc. And I think that's more of maybe what the attribute is casting a vision. Those churches that are able to cast a vision that says, this is where we're headed. We want to be a church and a community that looks like this, right? That shows up in our community in this way, etc. That's I think what we're trying. That's an attribute, or that's an attribute I think of a church that is going to experience more generosity. So as an example, if an example would be helpful, as an example, there's a church in Denver, Colorado Community Church, and I don't know if any of you know Colorado Community, but Pastor Jolinus has been there a very long time. The church set a goal that said, when we become the church, when we daily enter into communion with God, when we daily enter into worship, when we come together and learn about Scripture, we believe that there will be no foster child without a home in this state of Colorado. Think about that for a moment. Like that is, and that church alone experienced in unbelievable generosity, both of money, time, attention, etc. That it was partially responsible, very largely responsible, for an incredible reduction of foster kids without adoptive homes. And so I think that's an example of, it was just saying, when we become the church, we believe that this thing is going to happen. And I think that type of movement is a powerful activator of generosity.
Yeah, I love even the phrase that you use. I wonder if that's a fill in the blank for many of our pastors listening. When we become the church, or God has called us to be the church, and as we do that, fill in the blank, and to be able to clearly articulate what are the outcomes. And those are the things that drive then people's generosity. I love that. Could you speak to, I know you're so good with language, Dan, and just how we invite people to generosity. Could you talk to some of our pastors, some of our leaders on language, or the invitations that they're making to people to be generous?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that generosity is really fundamentally, generosity is a activity of sacrifice, right? It's fundamentally, generosity says to give of myself for something beyond myself. And I'm a firm believer that generosity, if you were to describe using attributes, if you were to describe what the kingdom of God were to be like, generosity has to be a top attribute. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why I believe that. But generosity is absolutely a top attribute. And I think what we find is that when we use language, when we in our work, certainly in my work as a fundraiser, but in our pastoral work, I think part of what it means to follow Jesus always includes the giving of myself for something beyond myself. Mm-hmm. It always includes the work of sacrifice, always. And I think that is really what generosity is. Generosity of money, giving a gift of money, is a subset, and potentially a very small subset. I take that back. I think it's actually a really important subset of the conversation of sacrifice, of when I follow the way of Jesus, I give. And I don't give just out of my comfort, out of my abundance. I give out of my sacrifice. I give out of sacrifice. I give beyond comfort. That for me is a challenge that I know in my own life. If my pastor stood up and shared that challenge with me and my community, my church community, it would be a powerful challenge to us, is to live lives outside of ourselves, to give of ourselves for something beyond ourselves.
Yeah, Dan,
in that work of sacrifice, I think that generosity is rooted.
Yeah, I love those thoughts, and when we were talking earlier, you talked about two specific invitations that
Yes.
all calls to sacrifice, all calls to generosity involve. Could you talk a little bit about those two invitations that some of our pastors are making as they're calling their congregations to be generous?
We talk about the invitation to impact and the invitation to belonging as two primary invitations that we extend to individuals to give of themselves, right? And so the invitation to impact is a bit more straightforward. The invitation to impact is when you give of yourself, something beautiful, amazing, and ultimately flourishing, right, occurs. And so that invitation to impact is painting the picture of what happens when a gift is given. What happens when someone says, you know what, I am going to give $1,000 to this organization. I am being invited to participate in something specific and missional happening out in the world. So that's the invitation to impact. And that's similar to my example of Colorado Community. Is they wanted to end every child up for adoption. They wanted to put into a home. Talk about an invitation to impact. Now, that's huge. You can ratchet that down to something far more feasible as well. But that was their invitation to impact that they extended to me. And I said, I want to make that happen. So I wrote them a check, right? And it wasn't like out of abundance. I said, what an invitation for my life to have an impact when I demonstrate sacrifice. So that's the first invitation. The second invitation is the invitation to belonging. And the invitation to belonging is primarily an invitation that says, I want to be a part of people. I want to be a part of something with others that fundamentally requires me to give. I want to be a part of a group of people that are also sacrificing in the same way, have similar heart, have a passion and a heart for something similar, that are for a similar thing. And I want to participate in that. And so being able to cast that invitation, invite people to say, we together we're in this, in a way, we belong together towards this, in this work of following Jesus. I think that's that language or that concept, week in, week out, day in, day out in our church life, it adds so much energy into our church life, into our individual relationship with church.
Yeah, I love that, Dan, because sometimes we can think about the invitation to impact, and it can sound very individualistic, like I want to make this difference, but you're saying that's important. And secondly is, I'm also a part of something, and we together are doing this thing together, and it's bigger than me, but I'm joining in that. And there are probably ways to celebrate that, to help people feel belonging to that impact, and that's an important invitation as well. There's some more questions that I want to ask you, but I'd like to start with some of the questions that we have from some of the people writing in. And again, write in your questions in the Q&A button down at the bottom tab of your Zoom screen. I want to go back to Nikki, and I got a question from Craig. And you talked about kind of these generational differences, and maybe whereas the baby boomers are more wired to think money first, maybe a younger millennial generation or Gen Z, or whoever that younger generation is, thinks more about hospitality or time or service. Craig writes, would be interested in ways to increase the younger generation's desire to give financially to those things they are passionate about. Seems like the boomer generation was content with regular giving, and millennials are more meet the need or the crisis driven, kind of that momentary. Yeah. Would love to hear your thoughts on how, and maybe it goes both ways. How do you spur boomers to think about generosity in other ways, but also how do you spur millennials then to also tie it to a regular practice of financial giving?
Yeah, we so we've done a lot of work at Thrivent on generosity, and keying off what Dan shared a little bit also is we truly believe that you can practice generosity and it actually makes you better. It actually makes you, it's like a muscle to be activated, a muscle to be worked, as opposed to just something that you are. Our research also doesn't show that once you have enough money, then you can be generous. That's not true either. What we actually learn is maybe even it starts with little kids, where they're working that muscle. They're learning how they actually experience generosity, and how. And so it's little acts along the way that actually I think help people figure out how to have this surplus mindset where they truly do believe all they have is a gift from God. We even find at Thrivent only about maybe 10 to 15% of our clients are really in that place of surplus where they truly believe all they have is a gift from God. The ones that do don't necessarily have tons of money. They have practiced that muscle of generosity and gratitude. And I think that's what, with our younger generations, that's actually what it actually changed my way of working with my kids and just getting them out and doing stuff and not just telling them they should be writing checks, but let's just get out and do something and grow that capability of generosity.
Yeah, I love that, Nikki. And just to think that there's not a correlation between giving as a percentage of income and the level of income. And you can type in most generous zip codes. There's data out there, and it's not always the wealthiest zip codes. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite. People who don't have a lot of means who are incredibly generous. And I think that's not a direct answer to Craig's question, but it's this idea that maybe a lot of younger adults are thinking, I don't actually have a lot of money to give, but how do you activate that and call them to that? Because they do have some resources, and it's not always tied to the level of income. So love your thoughts there. I want to go, this is sort of tied. I want to go to Dan now with that question as well, because I think for a lot of pastors, we're a little bit nervous about talking about money or generosity because we think there's perception that the church is always asking for money, or always asking for our time, or always asking to give in some way. And maybe that feels heightened among a younger generation. We feel like a younger generation is even more skeptical of hearing the church ask for money. What is the difference between what you're talking about and what Nikki is calling us towards generosity, versus maybe this fear that we might have as leaders to call people to be generous with their finances?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think from my perspective, there's like and it's diminishing. It has been diminishing, but is this trust in institutions, right? So I think when an institution, and that's especially true for under 40, under 40, and so I think that's part of it. I think that's part of if we have a hesitation that's kind of creeping, is that, and to be fair, there's some real examples of institutions, churches even, totally burning donors, and it's such a small percentage of churches, right? But it has kind of ruin the narrative for a lot of folks. But I think from my perspective, the difference between kind of activating generosity from younger individuals versus older is primarily this idea of missional link, advancing a mission versus building an institution. And I think that's, so my grandfather, gave to the Salvation Army because it was the Salvation Army. You just did it. But younger donors today, that does not weigh in their giving decisions. And it's more of this mission language that they want to participate in, that they want to join. And so I think for churches specifically, the difference here is activating generosity is activating the heart of generosity that says it's generous acts. It's an expression of not who you are necessarily, but also of your obedience and your faithfulness in following Jesus. It is an absolute fruit right? It's an absolute expression of what that's going to, of what that looks like. And it's not to build your church. No one, if you're under 40, sorry, donors under 40, they're not activated to build your church. They're activated to follow Jesus. They're activated to participate in the church and in the mission of God, of which your church is a part of. And so it's far less about your church's mission. And the fact is that the mission of God has a church. And that's what they want to participate in. So it's just that it's a pretty fundamental shift, but there's a shift of language.
Yeah, it seems like it ties into that call that you made before, and I think it applies to Craig's question of we need to be calling people to inviting them to an impact and inviting them to belonging. And as we focus on the impact, as we focus on the belonging, the mission of the church, it's seen as less maybe just blindly give to an institution that is doing good work. So. Love those thoughts. I want to go back to Nikki, and there's a question that comes in from I believe it's Gardini, and Gardini asked this question of sometimes churches we can seem inward focused, like give to us inside our doors. Some of the examples that you gave were really outward focused into the community. Can you talk about the importance of calling for generosity? It certainly has an internal component. We need to care about the institution, but also what is the importance of looking outside of ourselves and outside of our churches to our community and calling for generosity?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And, I probably will speak more from personal experience here, like with my church. I go to a large Lutheran church here in Minneapolis, South Minneapolis. We've been virtual now for several months, but I've loved how our church, we're seeing tons of participation, even in a COVID environment. We think our worship levels are actually like doubling or tripling. And I think one of the things that our church has very intentionally done is actually reached outside of ourselves. I happen to be on the council for our church too, so I get to see some of the conversations directly with our pastors around how do we wrestle with serving our community, but also reaching out. Our church also happens to be located about 2 miles from where George Floyd died. So it's a very visceral experience. And we've been talking about, okay, how do we partner up with the churches who were just impacted? They're right, literally next door to 38th in Chicago. How do we reach out to some of the food shelves and the food instability that we're seeing? We saw a lot of businesses that were actually burned just a few blocks from our church. And so that reaching out has been a powerful expression for us of generosity. And actually, I think in a very good, positive way has helped our community heal, not just from the pandemic, but then also from the unrest that we've seen, literally in our back doorstep. So I think reaching out, we know our research proves actually that feeling gratitude and being generous, being in that surplus mindset actually makes you healthier. It makes you happier. You can live longer. Some people say it even makes other people think you look better, but it also just helps one feel better, I think, in this pandemic to reach out more.
Yeah, love that. And would love to have access to some of that research. I know that other institutions have done that at Notre Dame. The Paradox of Generosity, Christian Smith has done some research around that correlation between health outcomes and gratitude and generosity. So absolutely right on that. I want to go back to Dan, and Peter has a great question. I know you think deeply about this question. Peter asked, what is the role of accountability, integrity, and reporting, including failures, in sustaining a culture of generosity? I think it's a temptation of pastors, missionaries, nonprofits who need ongoing revenue to tell half-truths in reporting impact, or just never getting back to reporting impact at all. Talk about that reporting function.
Sure, yeah. That's it's very true. In reporting, I think a few things. First is that so many leaders, they set hedged goals so that there's never failure, or that the likelihood of failure is low. And honestly, if there's one way to not activate generosity, it's by setting hedged goals. It's the least activating, the least compelling thing that someone can join. And that I think that goes for churches very much so as well. When we think about when churches think about how do we what mission are we really on? How are we communicating our role in God's kingdom here in this place? And so anyway, so my point in merely saying that is, I think it starts with goal setting. That I see a lot of leaders kind of set really hedged goals, so that reporting becomes it becomes so easy that it's almost useless, and that you can always say, yes, we've achieved our goal. And so the reporting becomes merely just a way to give like a really thinly veiled pat on our own back. And so very much against that. On the other side, I'm also very much against setting a big vision and then never reporting on it, or setting a big goal and then never reporting on it. There is a sense that people very much, it's part of the way people give and the way people participate. They want to feel like they're progressing towards something. And it's an actual heuristic that is kind of a behavioral economic, if you will, or it's a heuristic that in the way our brains make financial decisions, we actually want to participate in something that feels like it's progressing. And so reporting is incredibly not only it's useful, if not the right thing to do, but it's useful in actually bringing people along towards that aim that you promised. So I think it's useful. I think that more than anything, people, the first gift that someone makes is generally made on a promise of future impact. The second and third and fourth gift and larger gifts are made on the demonstration of that promised impact. Mm-hmm. And so reporting plays this incredibly strategic role in giving us energy towards that, making us feel like we're actually moving and progressing. But then also it is the thing that says, it's the thing that's going to activate my second, third, fourth multiple gift. And that's important. Without it, you lose credibility. I no longer trust you're going to use my gift in the right way. And I don't have faith that we're progressing. And so I will go somewhere else. And so I think that those are some thoughts on kind of the role of reporting and really accurate reporting along that. And failures need to be included in that. Otherwise, it just loses credibility. Again, if I sniff, and donors are becoming like this, if I sniff that you're lying to me or that you're hedging something, you will lose credibility in whether or not I am going to join you on the invitation you've extended.
Yeah, and it also seems to me that it feels so much more transactional. Like if I never hear a report, you just wanted to like get my money and forget about it, and you forgot that I did. It's almost an expression of gratitude on the receiver to say, and here's what that money did, and we're so grateful for that.
That's right. That's right. I mean, yeah, that's right. There's a whole stewardship element. That's just like that as much a moral thing as anything, which is to say, it's the way we demonstrate gratitude. Absolutely. Otherwise, to your point, Matt, it's just like a point of sale. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I want to go back to Nikki. And Nikki, the question comes from Charles. He says, what are the passions that motivate all types of financial givers? So are there certain and I think you both have alluded to these things, but are there certain passions in the human heart that regardless of income level, people get excited about giving?
Yeah. Well, I see from some of the notes that we're making that research available that we did with Barna, and you'll see a section in there that actually shows something around how givers feel about those passions. And givers, as they're thinking, obviously family, providing for their family is really, quite important. And then, giving charitably, serving God with their money, leaving a legacy for others are some of the passions that come out from a financial standpoint. And so, curiously enough, we found that not all Christians, as I'm sure you pastors know, not all yet have a giver mentality, or maybe are in that surplus mindset where they really know in their heart that Dan speaks so eloquently for, that it is a sacrifice, is a gift to be able to give. We have, some percent of Christians that actually still report that they're more in a keeping, holding, a scarcity. I want it all for myself, and maybe it's out of fear. But the research that we'll make available to you will give you some more insight around those passions, and family and giving charitably are a pretty important piece of it, the two largest that we see.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Love, and we will make that research available so all of you can access it. Dan, I want to go back to something that you and I have talked about, and what is the role of the pastor or the leader to communicate the ways that they themselves have demonstrated generosity in order to motivate others to be generous? We get these 2 points in the Sermon on the Mount. One is basically Jesus saying, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And I think there's a desire for many people to not speak about their own private, personal generosity, because it feels like we're going against that, command of Jesus. On the other hand, there's this reality in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said that let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So what is the role of leaders to demonstrate and be public about their generosity? Maybe they shouldn't be, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I want to see generosity celebrated, and I want to see acts of generosity celebrated. And so I think you can actually still do that without, you can do that. It does feel like a bit of a line, but it's primarily celebrating the act of generosity, which is fundamentally an act of worship. So it's a matter of like, how do we actually celebrate this act of worship to God, and not celebrate the person, the donor, right? But recognize that there's a celebrating the donor's faithfulness through an act of worship to God, and being really clear those two things are separate, right? And we really need to celebrate this act of generosity, which is fundamentally an act of worship to the Almighty. That I think I would love to see all churches do that. Actively, regularly, weekly celebrate worship through generosity, the worship of God through generosity. And ultimately, I think what that produces is a culture that fundamentally gives as an act of worship. And what a beautiful picture of a small, big, massive, tiny church community is one that is fundamentally worshiping through daily generosity. So I think that's what a vision for that would be. Simone Weil, one of my a great quote that she says is, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. So generosity it comes in multiple forms. It's not just money. It includes money, but it's not just money. But if we could celebrate that true act of worship across all forms of generosity, I think our churches would start to form and transform culture. Yeah.
Well, Nikki and Dan, one last question, and it's a big, massive question, and I'm going to ask you to answer it in 2 sentences or less. So here's your challenge. As the church expresses radical generosity in the months to come in a world that is so hurting, what do you hope would be true of the church in culture, in society, in the months ahead? So either one of you can jump in. It's a massive question, and I'm asking for 2 sentences, but who wants to jump in there? What do you
Go
hope?
ahead, Dan.
What would you hope would be
I'll
true?
go. I would, yeah, I would hope that 2020 would be the most, I would hope that the church in 2020 would be the most sacrificial group of people on the planet. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. That was one sentence, I think, Dan. Nikki, you want to take the final word?
I would hope that churches invite their worshipers, do one thing more around their generosity. Choose one thing. It could be taking some chocolate chip cookies to your next door neighbor in a paper bag if they've got COVID. It could be helping get something down to the food shelves where people need food. Do one thing more, and small neighborly acts of goodness, generosity will transform the world. That's what I would hope for.
Yeah, I love that call to God's people to be faithful wherever they're at, to take a concrete step. And what is that step? Calling people to action. Love that. Well, thank you so much to Nikki and Dan for being our panelists today and for your wisdom and insight and helping us think well about this. And thank you to all of you for joining us on this webinar. As always, our webinars will be posted on our YouTube channel, Made to Flourish YouTube channel, in the weeks to come. It's also available on our Facebook channel. Finally, if this is your first term joining us, you've never joined Made to Flourish, you've never gone to our website, you can go to our website, click Start Now, and as a small act of generosity, we want to send you a box of resources for free that will continue on this journey of helping equip our congregations to integrate faith, work, and economic wisdom for the flourishing of their communities. We're so grateful for your time, and we'll see you next time. Have a great week. Bye-bye.